The late summer light in Florence had a way of softening everything it touched. The city seemed to hum under the weight of history, the cobblestone streets warm beneath Isabella Moretti's heels as she walked toward the small trattoria Liam had chosen for their anniversary. She could still feel the lingering brush of his hand against hers from earlier, the quiet familiarity of a love she had convinced herself would last forever. Liam Hart, with his easy smile and English charm, had been the kind of man who made even the most ordinary moments feel like scenes from a film. In Florence, surrounded by art and architecture that had stood for centuries, their love felt equally indestructible. Inside, candles flickered against the old brick walls, their light dancing across Liam's face as he poured them each a glass of Chianti. They spoke of the future, trips they wanted to take, the dream of a gallery they could open together one day. A little house somewhere between London and Tuscany. Isabella listened, soaking in every word, her heart swelling at the certainty in his voice. The air smelled faintly of rosemary and fresh bread, the music soft and distant, as though the city itself had arranged a perfect backdrop just for them. Halfway through the evening, as they shared a plate of truffle pasta, Liam's phone buzzed against the table. It was nothing unusual. He was always busy with work, his network of clients and collectors, but something in the way he glanced at the screen made Isabella pause. His smile faded for the briefest moment, replaced by a flicker of something she couldn't quite name. He excused himself, taking the call outside, his voice low and hurried. Through the restaurant's open doorway, she could see him standing on the street, his back to her, his hand pressed firmly against his brow. When he returned, the smile was back, warm and reassuring, as if nothing had happened. He told her it was just a small issue with a client, nothing to worry about. Isabella nodded, though a strange heaviness had settled in her chest. She told herself it was nothing, just the natural curiosity of a woman in love, but the feeling lingered like a faint shadow in the glow of candlelight. Later that night, they walked along the Arno River, the Ponte Vecchio lit like a golden bridge to another time. Liam pulled her close, kissed her hair, and whispered, "Forever, Isa, you and me." She believed him because she wanted to, because the city was too beautiful for doubts, and because love, at least in that moment, felt eternal. Yet deep down, somewhere she didn't want to look, the seed had already been planted. And seeds, no matter how small, always find a way to grow. London in early autumn had a way of feeling both alive and distant. The city was a rush of muted colors, umbrellas bobbing along wet pavements, double-decker buses splashing through puddles, the faint scent of rain lingering in the air. Isabella settled back into her routine at the gallery, curating a new exhibition of post-war European painters. But even as she immersed herself in work, the aftertaste of that night in Florence clung to her thoughts. The phone call, the way Liam's voice had tightened, the smile that had returned a fraction too late. At first, she brushed it aside. Relationships, she reminded herself, were not perfect photographs. They were living things, messy and unpredictable. But then the late nights began. Liam, who used to rush home to tell her about his day, now sent brief messages about urgent meetings or client dinners that never seemed to end before midnight. When he was home, his phone was never far from his hand, always face down on the table, the sound switched to silent. One evening, while hanging his jacket by the door, her fingers brushed against something in the pocket. She pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn soft at the edges. A receipt from a hotel in Paris. Not the kind of place a business traveler would stay. It was intimate, expensive, a place meant for romance, not work. The date was from 2 weeks earlier, when Liam had told her he was in Manchester for a private art auction. When he came home that night, Isabella confronted him, holding the receipt between her fingers like evidence in a trial. "Care to explain this?" she asked, her voice steady but her pulse hammering. Liam didn't flinch. Instead, he let out a small laugh, as though she had caught him in something trivial. "Oh, that? A client insisted I meet him there. Last-minute trip? You know how this business works. Half the deals happen over overpriced champagne. He reached for her hand, brushing his thumb over her knuckles, his smile practiced and warm. You're overthinking, Isa. I'd never do anything to hurt you. She wanted to believe him, wanted to put the receipt back in the pocket and forget it existed. But doubt had already begun to weave itself into her thoughts, subtle but persistent. A few days later, over coffee in a small cafe near Covent Garden, she told her best friend Clara Hayes about the receipt, the phone calls, the late nights. Clara, with her sharp eyes and blunt truths, leaned forward and said, Isa, listen to me. When men start guarding their phones, they start guarding their lies. Don't let charm talk you out of your instincts. Isabella stirred her coffee slowly, watching the cream swirl into dark patterns. She didn't respond, but Clara's words sank in. The cracks in her trust were no longer invisible. They were spreading, fine lines running through the glass. And once glass is cracked, it never really goes back to the way it was. The night of the exhibition was one of those crisp London evenings where the air carried both the bite of approaching winter and the faint buzz of possibility. The gallery pulsed with quiet chatter, the clinking of champagne flutes, and the muted echo of shoes on polished marble floors. Isabella had curated the event herself, an exclusive preview of rare European modernist pieces that would draw collectors, critics, and the kind of faces that linger in society pages. She had been looking forward to it for weeks, not just because it was her work on display, but because Liam had promised he would be there, front row, beaming with pride. When he arrived, he was his usual magnetic self, well-dressed, charming, the kind of man who could blend into any crowd, yet still draw attention without trying. But he wasn't alone in the way Isabella expected. At his side stood a woman she had never seen before, striking in a way that was almost disarming. Tall, with dark hair swept into an effortless knot, she wore a deep green silk dress that seemed to catch the light with every movement. Liam introduced her as Sophie Delacroix, a gallery owner from Paris. From the moment Sophie's hand touched Isabella's, something felt off. Her grip was light, her smile polite, but her eyes lingered too long, as though she were studying Isabella in the way one might study a painting. Not for appreciation, but for flaws. Liam stood between them, his hand briefly brushing Sophie's back in a way that was too familiar to ignore. As the evening unfolded, Isabella found herself watching them more than she watched her own guests. She noticed the subtle things. The way Sophie leaned in to whisper something that made Liam smile, the way Liam seemed to search for her in the crowd when they were apart, the shared glances that felt private, even in a room full of people. And then there was the moment. Small, fleeting, but sharp enough to lodge in Isabella's mind. When their eyes met across the room, Sophie's lips curved into a smirk, just enough to suggest she knew something Isabella didn't. Isabella told herself she was imagining it, that she was reading too much into gestures and glances. But the unease from Florence, the torn receipt from Paris, the late nights, they all formed a pattern she could no longer ignore. She tried to lose herself in conversation with a prominent collector, smiling and nodding at the right moments. But every time she looked over, Sophie was there, in Liam's orbit. By the end of the night, when the last guests had left and the gallery stood quiet again, Isabella could still feel the weight of Sophie's smirk. It wasn't just the look of another woman, it was the look of someone who had already crossed a line. And for the first time, Isabella wondered if the life she had built with Liam was already slipping away, one silent glance at a time. The morning was quiet, the kind of quiet that made the ticking of the kitchen clock sound louder than it should. Isabella had been sitting at the table, sipping her coffee, flipping through notes for an upcoming auction. The doorbell broke the stillness. She wasn't expecting anyone, but she went to answer it. A courier stood there, rain clinging to his coat, a large envelope in his hand. "For Miss Moretti," he said. She signed for it without thinking, assuming it was related to work. The envelope was heavier than she expected. There was no return address, only her name typed neatly across the front. She carried it back to the table, set it down, and stared at it for a moment, her fingers hesitating at the seal. A strange unease settled in her chest, an instinct that told her opening it might change everything. She tore it open. Inside were photographs. At first, they seemed harmless. Liam in Paris, his familiar profile lit by the street lamps, the Eiffel Tower glowing in the background. But then her eyes caught the figure beside him, Sophie Delacroix. They weren't simply standing together. They were leaning into each other, their bodies angled in a way that spoke of intimacy. In one photo, they were sitting at a cafe in Montmartre, hands intertwined on the table as they laughed over wine. In another, Sophie rested her head against Liam's shoulder, her smile small but certain, the smile of a woman who felt she belonged there. Isabella's breath caught. The room seemed to tilt, her vision narrowing to the glossy images in her hands. The man who had once kissed her along the Arno, who had promised her forever under Florence's golden light, had been living another life in another city, with another woman. Her knees gave way, and she sank into the chair. The photographs spread across the table like shards of broken glass, each one reflecting a piece of the truth she had been too afraid to name. Every unanswered call, every late night, every smirk from Sophie now made perfect, devastating sense. She picked up one photo and stared at Liam's face. He looked happy, carefree in a way she hadn't seen in months. And that hurt more than the betrayal itself. It wasn't just that he had lied, it was that he had been living a joy with someone else while she sat at home, believing in him. Her phone buzzed on the counter. It was a text from Liam, "Running late, don't wait up for dinner." She didn't reply, she couldn't. Instead, she gathered the photos back into the envelope, her hands trembling, her mind turning over questions that had no answers. Somewhere deep inside, something shifted. The love she had clung to so fiercely was no longer a shield, it was a wound. And for the first time, Isabella understood that the life she thought she had was gone, replaced by a truth that demanded to be faced. The decision to leave London came suddenly, as if her body had decided before her mind could protest. The morning after the photographs arrived, Isabella booked the first flight she could find to Greece. She didn't tell Liam, she didn't tell anyone except Clara, who only said, "Go, Isa, don't let him see you break." By the time the plane touched down in Santorini, the sun was sinking toward the horizon, casting the island in a wash of gold and rose. The taxi wound through narrow streets lined with whitewashed houses, their walls glowing in the fading light. The sea stretched out endlessly, a calm blue that seemed to promise peace. She wanted to believe it could be that simple, that beauty could erase the ugliness of betrayal, but the weight inside her came with her, lodged deep and immovable. Her rented villa was perched on the edge of a cliff, the kind of place people came to for honeymoons and anniversaries. She stood on the balcony that first night, looking down at the waves crashing far below, the air thick with salt. She tried to breathe it in, to let it wash her clean, but every time she closed her eyes, she saw Liam. His hand on Sophie's back, the way he had smiled at her in Paris. The nights were the worst. The island would fall silent except for the distant hum of waves and the occasional bark of a stray dog. In those hours, memories pressed in on her. The taste of wine in Florence, the way Liam's voice had sounded when he said forever, the feel of his hand slipping into hers. She would wake before dawn, heart pounding, unsure if the tears on her face were from dreams or from remembering too much. On the third day, unable to bear the heaviness, she wandered into a small art supply shop in the village. She hadn't drawn in months, not since work had consumed her days and Liam had filled her nights. She bought a set of pencils and a sketchbook, telling herself it was just to pass the time. But when she sat at the balcony table later, the sea spread out before her. The pencil moved almost on its own. She sketched the curve of the horizon, the jagged edge of the cliffs, the way sunlight spilled over the roofs like liquid gold. But slowly her hands betrayed her heart, and Liam's face began to emerge on the page. Sharp jaw, tired eyes, the smile that had once undone her. She tore the page out, crumpled it, and started again. This time it was Sophie, her smirk rendered in clean, cruel lines. Another page ripped away, and so it went. Drawing, erasing, starting over. The sketchbook became a silent witness to her pain, each page a confession she couldn't speak aloud. She filled it with fragments, hands reaching but not touching, empty wine glasses, the shadow of a man walking away. She didn't think of it as art. She thought of it as survival. Every evening the sun set in the same spectacular blaze, and every evening she told herself she would feel lighter tomorrow. But the truth clung to her like the salt in the air. You can leave a city, you can leave a man, but you cannot leave the pieces of yourself they've already taken. The flight back to London felt different from the one that had taken her to Greece. She had left in pieces, bleeding silently, but now she returned with a cold clarity. The sleepless nights in Santorini had hardened something inside her. She was no longer looking for closure. She was looking for truth, and if truth came with destruction, so be it. The city greeted her with its usual gray skies and damp air. As the cab rolled past familiar streets, she felt an almost surreal distance from the life she had once lived here. Her flat was exactly as she had left it, but the photographs of her and Liam on the shelves looked like artifacts from another life, one she no longer claimed. She packed them away in a box without hesitation. It didn't take long for the whispers to reach her. A colleague at the gallery, speaking in a lowered voice, mentioned that Liam had been making bold moves in the art market, purchasing properties, selling rare works from private collections. Then Clara called one evening, her voice tight with disbelief. "Isa, I think you need to see this." Clara forwarded an article from a London business journal. The headline read, "Hart and Delacroix expand their empire with historic estate acquisition." The accompanying photo was a gut punch. Liam and Sophie standing on the steps of her late father's countryside estate, the very property she had been too heartbroken to visit in years. She had believed it was still hers, left to her in her father's will, locked away in memory as a place of safety. Her hands trembled as she dug through her files until she found the old deed. Something didn't add up. The article claimed Liam had purchased it legitimately, but the signature on the transfer documents, supposedly hers, was a forgery. She knew her own handwriting, and this was not it. The realization settled over her like ice. They hadn't just betrayed her heart, they had stolen from her bloodline. Her father had built that estate from nothing, restored every stone with his own hands. To see it in Liam's possession, handed over to Sophie's smirking grasp, was an offense that burned deeper than any personal heartbreak. That night, Isabella didn't cry. She sat at her desk until dawn, researching legal loopholes, contacting discreet investigators, and piecing together a trail of Liam's transactions. The deeper she dug, the more rot she found. Shell companies, offshore accounts, forged appraisals, and sales of artwork that had been lost from museum inventories. By morning, she knew this wasn't just about taking back the estate. It was about dismantling everything they had built together, brick by brick, deal by deal, until there was nothing left for them to stand on. Heartbreak had made her retreat once, but this time she wasn't running. She had returned to London not as the woman who had been left behind, but as the woman who would burn their empire to the ground and watch from the ashes. Daniel Cross was not the kind of man Isabella would normally trust. He had a reputation in London's media circles for digging where no one wanted him to, for exposing scandals that left powerful people scrambling for cover. But Clara knew him through a charity board, and when Isabella told her she needed someone who could cut through lies without hesitation, Clara didn't hesitate. "Daniel's ruthless," she said. "Exactly what you need." They met in a small cafe on Fleet Street, the kind of place where the clatter of cups and constant hum of conversation made private discussions safer. Daniel arrived late, trench coat damp from the rain, eyes sharp and assessing. He listened without interrupting as Isabella laid out everything: Liam's affair, the forged documents for her father's estate, the suspicious art sales. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair and gave a slow nod. "You're not asking me to write an exposé," he said. "You're asking me to build a case, and you want it airtight." "Yes," Isabella replied. "I want him stripped of everything he's stolen. I want her name, both their names, burned into the record for what they've done." From that moment, the work began. Daniel was meticulous. Within a week, he had traced a network of transactions from Liam's new gallery to shell companies in the Cayman Islands, some under Sophie's name, others buried beneath layers of fake ownership. He found proof that several paintings donated to museums had quietly been replaced with skilled forgeries, the originals sold to private buyers for millions. They met almost daily, often in Daniel's cramped office lined with dusty filing cabinets and stacks of old newspapers. Isabella brought coffee, Daniel brought evidence, bank statements, shipping records for artworks that had vanished from Liam's inventory. Emails between Liam and Sophie discussing clearing out pieces before audits. Each new discovery was like another bullet loaded into a gun Isabella hadn't realized she'd been holding. Late one night, Daniel handed her a folder heavier than the rest. Inside were photographs of Liam meeting with a known art smuggler in Marseille, the same man linked to stolen antiquities from war zones. "This," Daniel said, tapping the photo, "isn't just fraud. This is criminal on an international scale." Isabella stared at the image, a strange calm settling over her. The man she had once shared a bed with wasn't just a liar. He was a thief, a criminal, and a coward. And now, thanks to Daniel, she had the proof to tear his carefully crafted world apart. She stored every document, every photograph, in a locked case in her flat. Each piece felt like part of a larger weapon she was building, one that required patience and precision to use. She would not strike too soon. She would wait until the stage was set, until there was nowhere for them to run, and no lie they could tell that would save them. The storm was coming, and Isabella was the one calling the thunder. If you want, I can move into Chapter 8, The Public Reckoning, where Isabella executes her plan at the perfect moment, making the exposure as public and humiliating as possible. The charity gala in Rome was the kind of event where appearances mattered more than purpose. Held in the grand ballroom of a restored 17th century palazzo, its marble floors gleamed under the glow of crystal chandeliers. The air smelled faintly of roses and expensive perfume, and the guest list was a parade of Europe's wealthiest collectors, politicians, and art patrons. Liam and Sophie were on the host committee, using the event to cement their reputation as philanthropic visionaries. They didn't know Isabella would be there. She arrived in a floor-length black gown, simple but commanding, her hair swept back, her presence calm and unshakable. She moved through the crowd like a ghost from their past, smiling politely when eyes lingered on her, but never revealing her hand. Daniel was already in place, working behind the scenes with the gala's tech crew. Weeks of planning had led to this night, time to ensure the exposure would be public, undeniable, and impossible to contain. The evening began as expected. Guests sipped champagne and admired the art displayed for auction. Liam, in his tailored tuxedo, charmed donors with well-rehearsed warmth. Sophie, radiant in a silver gown, stayed close to him, her hand brushing his arm in practiced intimacy. Isabella watched from across the room, her expression unreadable. When the auction began, the lights dimmed and a giant projector illuminated the wall behind the stage. The first few slides were exactly what everyone expected. Photos of the art, shots of restoration work, smiling children from the charities the gala claimed to support. Liam took the stage to speak, his voice smooth, confident, and then the next image appeared. Not a painting, not a charity. It was Liam, in grainy but clear footage, shaking hands with a man identified in international reports as a notorious art smuggler. The room stilled. The following slide showed Sophie signing a shipment manifest for stolen antiquities. Then came bank records, transaction trails, and photographs of both of them in Paris, Marseille, and other cities where illicit deals had taken place. The evidence Daniel had gathered unfolded in a sequence designed for maximum impact, layer upon layer of theft, forgery, and laundering. Gasps rippled through the marble hall. Some guests covered their mouths. Others turned to stare at Liam and Sophie, whose expressions shifted from confusion to horror. Liam stepped forward, trying to stop the projection, but Daniel had already locked the system from the control booth. The images kept coming, emails, signatures, photos, each one more damning than the last. And then, as the final slide faded, the sound of footsteps echoed sharply against the marble. Uniformed Italian police officers entered the ballroom, flanked by plainclothes investigators. They moved with quiet authority, parting the crowd as they approached the stage. Liam Hart, Sophie Delacroix, one officer announced in accented English, "You are under arrest for fraud, money laundering, and trafficking in stolen art." The crowd erupted into whispers and the metallic clicks of camera phones. Sophie's face drained of color. Liam looked around for help, but there was none, only the cold gaze of people who had once admired him. Isabella stood near the back, watching as handcuffs closed around their wrists. As they were let out, Liam's eyes found hers. There was no plea, no anger, only the stunned realization that she had done this. Isabella didn't move, didn't smile, didn't speak. The evidence had spoken for her, and in that moment, the balance between them shifted forever. The courtroom was cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. It smelled faintly of old paper, polished wood, and the quiet tension of lives about to change. Isabella sat in the second row behind the prosecution's table, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression composed. Months of investigation had led here, to this single room where the truth would no longer be whispered in shadows, but spoken aloud, recorded, and preserved. Liam entered first, wearing a dark suit that looked looser on his frame than it once would have. His hair was shorter, his eyes tired, but his posture still carried the remnants of a man used to controlling the room. Sophie followed, impeccably dressed, her face a mask of disdain. When their eyes swept over the gallery, Liam's lingered on Isabella, almost as if he were searching for a flicker of the woman who had once loved him. Sophie didn't bother hiding her glare. The prosecution laid out the case in methodical detail: bank statements, photographs, witness testimonies, and the forged documents that had transferred her father's estate into Liam's hands. Daniel testified, his voice steady as he explained the trail of transactions and illicit deals. Isabella listened without moving, though every mention of her father's name sent a quiet ache through her chest. When it was Liam's turn to speak, he stood and addressed the judge directly. His voice was softer than she remembered, the edges worn down. He spoke of mistakes, of pressures in the art world, of intentions misunderstood. At one point, he glanced toward Isabella and said, "I never meant to hurt her." The words hung in the air, empty of the power they might once have held. Sophie's statement was shorter, colder. She accused the prosecution of twisting the facts, of targeting them because of jealousy and influence. She never once looked at Isabella, as if acknowledging her would give her some sort of victory. The judge's verdict came after a brief recess. Liam Hart, guilty on multiple counts of fraud, money laundering, and possession of stolen property. Sophie Delacroix, guilty as an accomplice in the same crimes. Both were sentenced to lengthy prison terms. Their assets were ordered seized, the estate returned to Isabella as its rightful owner. Her father's name was cleared in the official record. There was no applause, no dramatic moment of triumph, just the sound of the gavel striking once, sharp and final. Liam's shoulders slumped as officers moved to escort him away. Sophie's chin remained high, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of panic. Isabella didn't stand until they were gone. She walked out of the courtroom into the pale afternoon light, feeling the cool air against her skin. Justice had been served, every fact confirmed, every lie dismantled, but the weight in her chest hadn't lifted. Victory, she realized, didn't erase the years she had lost, the trust that had been shattered, or the love that had died in such an ugly way. She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and stepped into the street. The world moved on around her, as if nothing monumental had just happened. And maybe that was the point. Justice was never about erasing the past. It was about finding the strength to carry it and still move forward. The mornings in Manhattan were different from London, different from Florence, different from anywhere else Isabella had lived. The city didn't wake slowly. It came alive all at once, the hum of traffic below and the faint, steady pulse of possibility in the air. From her balcony on the 23rd floor, she could see the skyline stretching out in every direction, glass towers catching the first light of day. In her hands, the coffee was warm, comforting, grounding her in a life that felt entirely her own. It had been 8 months since the trial. 8 months since she had last seen Liam's face, pale under the harsh lights of the courtroom. In that time, she had left London for good, selling her flat and putting the estate her father had left her into the care of a trusted foundation. She didn't need to live there. It was enough that it was hers again, untarnished. In New York, she built something new. She rented a loft that doubled as a studio, its wide windows flooding the space with light. She began to draw again, not out of pain this time, but out of a hunger to create. Slowly, the sketches turned into full collections, portraits of strength, resilience, and the quiet beauty of starting over. Her agent convinced her to put them into a book, paired with the story she had once been too afraid to tell. When Love Becomes a Wound was released in spring. She had braced herself for mixed reactions, for whispers about her past, but instead, the memoir climbed the bestseller lists within weeks. Letters poured in from strangers across the world, people who saw themselves in her story, who thanked her for putting words to the kind of betrayal they had thought they were alone in surviving. She learned to walk the streets without looking over her shoulder. She learned that healing didn't come in one moment, but in thousands of small ones. The first morning she didn't think of him, the first time she laughed without feeling guilty, the first time she looked in the mirror and saw herself instead of the woman he had left behind. Daniel visited once during a book signing in the city. They shared dinner, talked about everything except Liam and Sophie. He told her she seemed lighter, and she realized he was right. The need for revenge that had once fueled her had burned out, leaving room for something steadier. Now, standing on the balcony, watching the sun turn the tops of the buildings gold, she felt no pull to look back. The past was there, unchangeable, but it no longer defined her. She had told her story, taken back her name, and built a life entirely her own. She took a slow sip of coffee, the steam curling into the cool morning air, and smiled. Not the smile of a woman who had won a battle, but the smile of someone who had walked away and discovered that survival was, in the end, the sweetest justice of all.